I'm going to talk about feline coronavirus and FIP today, and specifically I'm going to review some of the things we want to make sure everybody knows and kind of understands where we're coming from in terms of our traditional understanding. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about what's on the horizon. And I actually have Dr. Gary Whitaker in the audience today as well. Many of you are familiar with the Whitaker Lab. So I'm hoping we'll have some time where we can actually entertain some more laboratory and kind of diagnostic questions that you may have. But FIP and corona in shelters is a particular problem because we actually have one of the highest risk populations. Whether it's in a traditional brick and mortar shelter, whether it's a foster system, whether it's a rescue-based system. And so honestly, this happens where we live. And so there's many things that we need to do, but in terms of our management, in terms of our strategic planning around these populations, to really try and both prevent the disease and then control it when we see it. So let's make sure we're all on the same page. We'll do a little bit of review. So feline coronavirus. It's a pretty virus, I think. I had the honor of working on the chapter in the new infectious disease for shelter medicine book, and Dr. Lori Peek from Maddie's Fund actually illustrated this virus for me. So I have an amazing drawing that she did of it. It's an intestinal virus, as you know. Generally, feline coronavirus causes a self-limiting diarrhea, and it's ubiquitous in our cat populations. And so we're never going to kind of eliminate that from our cat problems, but it on its own is not a big deal. It's a large positive stranded RNA genome, and why do we care about that? Well, we care because it's a large virus, so it's actually hard to study, and it's hard to map even with our newer technologies. It's hard to sequence because it's so big. Because it's so big, there's more opportunity for mutations in the virus, and so that's why we see some of the challenges in not only diagnosing it, but kind of wrapping our hands around treatments or vaccines. And because it's so big, it is highly susceptible to mutation. And so it's a mutable virus that's changing all the time, changing between cats. And so I feel like as a profession, as a veterinary profession, we're chasing it as quickly as we can, but it's a really hard thing to wrestle with. So it has a tropism for epithelial cells, so it makes sense that it would impact our GI system in particular, but certainly we can see coronavirus in other areas, and so that may be something, and we'll kind of talk about it a little bit later, that we investigate as we go along. Traditionally, we talk about two serotypes of coronavirus, so two different serotypes. One is a type 1, and that has predominated in Europe and in America, and then a type 2, which is actually a recombination of the feline virus with the canine coronavirus, as we've understood it. And that is primarily in Asia. And this kind of typing system will come up a little bit later as we talk about some of the more recent outbreaks that have occurred. But we talk about two serotypes of coronavirus, and both of those can result in FIP when the right mutations occur. Oh, that's Dr. Lori Peek's drawing. I'm glad I actually included it. I wasn't sure I did, which I think is particularly beautiful. She's a veterinarian, but she's also a medical illustrator. And so it was nice of her to do that for me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about nomenclature. And again, we kind of moved into this nomenclature. We may be advancing out of it. But generally, we're going to use FCOV for feline coronavirus, that common ubiquitous virus that we see that causes self-limiting diarrhea. I'm going to use FECV to talk about the enteric biotype, the virus when it enters intestinal epithelial cells and actually impacts and causes some disease there. And then I'm going to use FIPV to represent that mutation of the virus that has a tropism for macrophages and ultimately results in the FIP syndrome, which is the disease syndrome. So just for clarity, that's how I'm going to use the nomenclature for this lecture. There's still some questions about how much these are really separate, depending on the sequencing and on a molecular level, but this is going to serve for our understanding of what we're talking about today. So transmission of coronavirus, absolutely widespread. In a densely housed population, which is our nice terminology for overcrowded shelters, hoarding facilities, and kitten season. And It is up to 90% of cats are seropositive. So, reminding you, seropositive means they have had antibody responses to the coronavirus. They have been exposed. That doesn't mean they have active disease necessarily, but they've been exposed. Up to 90% in our densely housed populations. There was a shelter study that investigated cats and kittens at the point of entry to a shelter, and then 1 week later, a third of the cats were seropositive when they came in. Or I'm sorry, this is a shedding study. We're shedding coronavirus at entry, and 1 week later, greater than 60% of them were shedding. So we know that exposure happens in our shelters, and we know that they will then shed, which means they can go on to essentially pass this disease through our population, depending on our housing and husbandry practices. It can be transmitted in several ways. Oronasal is what we think of most commonly, fecal-oral, and then transplacental, all possible. So obviously cat-to-cat contact is an issue, but litter boxes are a big issue, especially because that's what they're shedding into. And the shedding can go on for months to years. So this is not going to be something that we eradicate. This is going to be something that we need to talk about risk mitigation. Like most of our diseases that we talk about in veterinary medicine and most of our diseases that we talk about in shelters. And so we're going to be mitigating this risk from the moment a cat walks into our organization. Long-term studies have demonstrated that there are cycles of shedding, recovery, and reinfection. So a cat can get coronavirus, shed it, stop shedding. They can actually get reinfected, often with a different coronavirus, shed, and all of that. Seroconversion, just because you have a serology, you're positive on serology for coronavirus, does not protect you against getting coronavirus again. And some of that may speak to the fact that it's a highly mutable virus and coronaviruses change. And so therefore, just because you had one doesn't mean you're protected against a different mutation. And so there are cycles of this constantly.